welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico episode 17, Here, Corn is God. Last time we continued to discuss Oñate's efforts to establish a Spanish colony in New Mexico. We discussed the events of the Acoma Massacre and the movement of the capital from the pueblo of Oquehuingue to San Gabriel. During the next year and a half, from 1599 to 1600, he mostly focused on conversion efforts in the pueblos and searching for mines. During this time, he would send the surviving Zaldivar to find the Pacific. They would make it as far as southwestern Arizona before they would turn back. Supplies were also becoming harder to find, forcing the Spanish to look further afield to obtain the supplies they needed. The pueblos and other groups the Spanish were demanding supplies from were also beginning to push back against the Spanish. For instance, on his way west, Zaldivar would demand supplies from the Humanos. Instead of the requested supplies, the Humanos claimed poverty and gave him stones instead. The Humano resistance would be taken as an insult, and again caused Oñate to decide to use force to put down a potential rebellion before it could spread. He would demand blankets as a punishment, and then would make camp nearby. The next day he decided that the blankets were not enough punishment. A quarter of the pueblo would be lit aflame, and a volley would be shot into the crowd of Puebloans. 2 war leaders were captured and hung. In total, 7 or 8 people would be killed. During the next conversation with the Humanos, Oñate started to suspect that his interpreter, not Tomas or Cristobal, was bad-mouthing the Spanish. As a result, he'd have the interpreter hung. All of these events appeared to have cowed the Humanos. But by Christmas 1600, they'd begin to retaliate by attacking and killing some Spaniards. This would spark another panic about general rebellion among the pueblos. In spring 1601, a punitive expedition was sent to the Humano pueblo. After a short skirmish and a 6-day siege, a pueblo would be taken and burned. A male pueblo prisoner would be given to each of the Spanish men. 2 other pueblos would also be burned as part of the Humano War. An estimated 800 people would die during the conflict. Gaspar Perez de Villagra, seeing the loyal captain, would suddenly defect, seeking sanctuary in a church. 2 other captains would also desert around this time. 1601 would be a cold, hungry winter for the Spanish. Oñate wished to go to Quivira, but was unable to do so for a variety of reasons. Overall, the Spanish weren't happy. They were dependent on what food they would get from the pueblos, which only had so much food themselves, and the new leader of the clergy, Father Escalona, did not get along with Oñate. On the food situation, Father Escalona would write the following, quote, "Here, corn is God. Any Spaniard who gets his fill of tortillas feels as if he has obtained a grant of nobility." End quote. Spanish had tried to plant wheat and other European crops in the area above Chama, but the results had been disappointing. The pueblos themselves did not have large amounts of supplies to spare for the Spanish, which had contributed to conflicts between the groups. A lot of settlers were not prepared for the cold winters of New Mexico, being used to warmer climates. Dissension was rife. As mentioned before, some of Oñate's captains had deserted, and several more men would try. Pablo de Aguilar, a man Oñate had twice pardoned, was finally killed. The exact reason that pushed Oñate to kill Aguilar is not known. It is also possible that Oñate had killed another man for trying to leave after he had given this man permission to leave, as he would later be accused. Oñate had begun to get more cruel in an apparent attempt to keep the whole colony from falling apart. Somewhere along the way, though, he decided to mount an expedition that summer. He initially announced that he was going to go to the Pacific Ocean, but changed his mind and instead went to Quivira. 70 men plus servants and guides would be chosen to go. Some of these 70s would be the troublemakers Oñate had been trying to deal with. On their way across the plains, the Spanish would meet a group that Oñate would call the Escanjaques. The Escanjaques would confirm that the Quivirans had killed Umana and his men. When they arrived at Quivira, they were told that if they continued onwards, they'd be overwhelmed by hostile tribes. Seeing the seashells this tribe had, Oñate figured he must be close to the coast. He would push on despite these warnings, making it about 3 leagues before his men would refuse to continue onwards. He would be forced to turn back. On the return, there would be a scuffle with the Escanjaques that would end in a stalemate before Oñate would withdraw from the plains with no further incident. While Oñate was gallivanting around the plains, the colonists were left to their own devices. Very soon after, they began to air their grievances. They'd entered the venture at great expense, and what did they have to show for it? Hungry bellies, dark, cramped apartment in some remote village, the promise of subpar silver. By September 7th, a priest gave a speech imploring the Spanish to abandon the colony. It didn't take long before all the priests were in agreement that it was time to leave. Many of his captains also wanted to leave. Oñate had lost control of the situation in his absence. While there were those who wished to remain, they were told in private that they were alone in their desire to stay. The people Oñate left in charge made no effort to keep order. They had decided to side with those who wanted to leave. That October, the deserters, around 400 people, or 2/3 of the colony, would leave. Only about 25 soldiers remained behind to greet Oñate when he returned on November 24th. Immediately, he took legal measures against those who had left, sentencing the leaders to death. He would send Zaldivar out to apprehend them. The deserters would escape capture, making it to Santa Barbara. Here, their campaign of letters against Oñate would begin. Zaldivar would catch up to the men, only to find them under royal protection. He decided to head further south to try and begin damage control. The viceroy was trying to sort the whole matter out himself. Now he had conflicting reports. so he had a panel of judges make a decision. Against established custom at the time, the judges decided that deserters were colonists first and soldiers second. Thus, Oñate had no cause to have these men returned to him, and instead he should be the one to be investigated. That isn't to say everything was going downhill for Oñate at this time. In May 1602, Zaldivar tried to get help for the struggling colony. The viceroy didn't care, and Zaldivar would go to Spain to try and get help. Furthermore, his government was made independent from the viceroy in Mexico City. While in Spain, Zaldivar would try and appeal to the king, but by then even the crown knew just how bad the situation was, and he tossed it back down to the viceroy to decide on. He also included that the viceroy was to decide if Oñate was still fit for office, although he did extend a loan to Zaldivar to allow him to get recruits. In 1603, Zaldivar would return to the New World. The next few years were mostly uneventful. Sometime in 1602 or early 1603, the colony would receive a new set of friars led by Fray Francisco de Escobar. In 1603, there would be a punitive expedition launched against Taos after some unrecorded event occurred there. In 1604, Oñate decided once again to try and find the Pacific. He would take a party of 30 men, leaving about 50 behind. This expedition would go to the Colorado River and then descend it to the Gulf of California, arriving at the ocean in January 1605. They would spend a few days on the Gulf of California before returning. On their return, they would carve the following at El Morro. Quote, Paso por aquí el adelantado Don Juan de Oñate del descubrimiento de la Mar del Sur a 16 de abril de 1605, end quote. Or, in English, quote, passed by here the adelantado Don Juan de Oñate from the discovery of the South Sea on the 16th of April 1605, end quote. At the time, the Spanish referred to the Pacific Ocean as the South Sea. Not long after his return to San Gabriel, the capital was still struggling. Oñate and Father Escobar were going to return to Mexico City to try and get more reinforcement. Oñate would make it to the area around Santa Barbara on this return trip, where he'd have to turn back, citing health issues. In the meantime, the viceroy had been replaced. The new viceroy, Montes Claros, interrogated those who had returned. From them, he determined that the conquest Oñate claimed was really a fairy tale. He knew that to abandon the new province would be difficult to do in good conscience. However, it could be remedied if they removed Oñate. In June 1606, Philip III sent orders to Mexico City that Oñate was to return to Mexico to be detained until an investigation could be carried out. These orders did not reach Mexico City until 1607, when Viceroy Luis de Velasco, whom you might remember as the man who had first encouraged Oñate to undertake the venture, had returned to power. By 1606, the situation in the colony was critical. The Navajos and Apaches were now hostile, burning pueblos, stealing Spanish livestock, and even going as far as to attack San Gabriel itself. Punitive campaigns in this period appeared to have little effect. In autumn 1606, Zaldivar would return. Oñate would write to the viceroy the following around that time. Quote, finding myself helpless in every respect, because I have used up on this expedition my estate and the resources of my relatives and friends, amounting to more than 600,000 pesos, I find no other means than to renounce my office, which resignation I am sending your excellency. End quote. This letter of resignation was dated August 24th, 1607. He had not yet learned that he had been recalled. In this letter, he noted he would hold the colonists until 1608, at which point, if he had not heard anything else, he would release them from any obligation to remain in the colony. The viceroy would send a note back, dated February 27, 1608, that Oñate was released from his office, but he was to remain until he received further orders. One of the captains, Juan Martinez de Montoya, was appointed temporary governor, but Montoya refused the appointment. Instead, Juan de Oñate's son, Cristobal, was appointed the governor from the Cabildo. Cristobal was around 16 or 17 at this time. As he had created the Cabildo, Juan had probably engineered this result. It was around this time that the Spanish would begin establishing Santa Fe. They may have moved the capital as early as 1607. The town was formally established under Pedro de Peralta in 1610, as we'll talk about in future episodes. In 1608, Viceroy Velasco advised the king that the best course of action may be to throw in the towel. The Council of the Indies agreed with the viceroy, but the king took his time mulling over the decision. This gave one group a chance to save the beleaguered colony. In 1608, the Franciscans went on a campaign of mass baptisms among the pueblos, some 7,000 in total, to try and save the colony. This effort was enough to convince the crown that they could no longer abandon New Mexico in good conscience. Instead, they were to convert the colony of New Mexico into a royal colony and start footing the bill for its upkeep. Cristobal was denied the governorship. Oñate had the opportunity for appointment elsewhere if he merited it, though. With the arrival of the new governor in 1609, Pedro de Peralta, there were orders for the Oñates to return to Mexico City. He would arrive in Mexico City on April 30th, 1610, 15 years after signing his contract. The next 3 years of his life are not recorded. After that, he would return to Las Minas de Panaco, which he found on the verge of bankruptcy. He would reorganize the venture. Zaldivar's mines would also make a small fortune upon his return. Normally this is where we would leave Oñate, but there's still a little bit to talk about. In 1603, legal trouble finally caught up with Juan. The new viceroy, the Marquis de Guadalcazar, Diego Fernandez de Cordova, finally took up a case against Oñate, with proceedings beginning in May 1614. There were 30 charges against Juan in total. Among them were trivial complaints, like that he allowed the Zaldivars to address him as Your Majesty. Many of the witnesses against him were deserters. His defense was that they bore him ill will and malice. Of the 30, he would be acquitted of 17. From Mark Simmons, The Last Conquistador, quote, his crimes included unjustly hanging 2 Indians, using excessive force in putting down the Acoma Rebellion, living immorally at San Gabriel by committing adultery and thus setting a bad example for his soldiers, executing Captains Pablo de Aguilar and Alonso de Sosa de Albornoz, ordering Captains Villagra and Marquez to put to death 2 deserters, and so on. End quote. His sentence, pronounced on May 13, 1614, would be the following. Exile from New Mexico in perpetuity, 4 years of exile from Mexico City, and a fine of 6,000 Castilian ducats. Some other members of the expedition would also be charged, but overall, Juan got away with a lenient sentencing. Juan de Oñate would spend years trying to appeal the whole thing, but tragedy was not over for Oñate and his family. Cristobal would marry and have a son before dying at 22 in 1612. Maria de Oñate y Cortés, his daughter, would marry Vicente de Zaldivar. In 1630, Vicente's wealth would fail and he would die in 1650, leaving Maria in humble circumstances. Oñate's wife would pass in 1619 or 1620 while he was trying to appeal his sentencing. In 1617, he would appeal directly to the king, an appeal that was ignored. After the king passed and a new king, Philip IV, came to the throne, Oñate would again try to appeal his banishment and revoke his titles. The councils of the Indies suggested the king do so, but it ended up on the shelf. Oñate would continue to appeal to the king. Eventually in 1623, the fine would be reimbursed. He then tried to get the title of a marquis and adelantado in perpetuity. To this, the Council of the Indies flat out refused. He would, however, win an appointment to the Military Order of Santiago in 1620. In 1624, he was offered a position as a mining inspector in Spain. It brought no salary, but it was a prestigious title, and there were few men as qualified for mining ventures as Oñate. During 1625 and 1626, he would move from mine to mine. During his inspections, he would get ill. During the recovery, he would enter a mine on June 3rd, 1626. There he would collapse and die. What do we make of Juan de Oñate and his legacy? Mark Simmons, in the conclusion to his biography on Oñate, The Last Conquistador, offers the following remarks. Quote, in life, Juan de Oñate was never the hero of his own story, rather the victim of his personal catastrophes. What a terrible thing it is to go and discover new lands and endure their excessive toils, wrote Cortez's granular soldier Bernal Diaz. That was a truism Oñate easily understood, owing to his New Mexico experience. George P. Hammond characterized that 15-year episode as a personal disaster for Oñate, brought on by vacillation and dalliance of royal officials, by the jealousy of rivals, and by the poverty of New Mexico. He might have added also, for the sake of completeness, that some of the blame doubtlessly could be traced to Don Juan's own flaws. It is tempting to suggest that Oñate, in the work of creating his own kingdom on the Rio Grande, ought to be judged a failure, simply from the fact that he accomplished virtually nothing he had set out to do, and went home at last in disgrace. Oddly, however, Don Juan did not see things in that light, and in fact we have every reason to believe that while he was disappointed with the way events in New Mexico turned out, he did not view his efforts there as a failure. Even at the end, when every one of his projects had soured and his funds were exhausted, he was eager to stay on the Rio Grande and continue trying to develop the new but floundering realm into the northern wilderness. Such dogged persistence was a hallmark of a conquistador's irreducible individual. Seen by the long perspective afforded by history, Juan de Oñate's performance seems more accomplished than it did at the time. The foundations he established proved solid and were built upon by others, often in ways that Don Juan could have never anticipated. He was the godfather of the Franciscan missionary program on the northern frontier, which within 2 centuries stretched from the Texas Gulf to coastal California. He can be credited with launching the livestock industry of the Southwest. For the herds of horses and cattle and flocks of sheep he brought in 1598 furnished the foundation for ranching. He inaugurated mining and the first processing of ores, and he made a notable contribution through his wide-ranging explorations toward an understanding of the true geography of Western America. Oñate's grandest achievement, of course, resided in his establishment of a new kingdom, afterward downgraded to the status of a province, within the Spanish Empire. At the time, he set great store by the titles of governor and adelantado, but he would probably have been pleased to know that 400 years later he was still remembered and considered deserving of another title, Father of New Mexico, that realm of which he was the architect. While not evolving into the viceroyalty he had hoped, did grow to become a chief anchor and most populous province in the Spanish borderlands. By now it also appears fairly certain that Oñate deserves partial and perhaps even primary honors for the founding of Santa Fe, which exists today as one of the oldest cities in America, and the first surviving municipality erected in the West. His accolades, moreover, include the designation of road blazer, since he was the man who opened and marked the Camino Real from the Chihuahuan mining settlements to northern New Mexico. That was the first established thoroughfare laid out by Europeans within a portion of the present limits of the United States. In various categories, then, New Mexico's founding governor left an enduring and memorable legacy. In the career of Juan de Oñate, we find a summation of the motives, aspirations, tensions, strengths, and weaknesses of the Hispanic pioneers who settled the borderland. For a dozen years between 1598 and 1610, he lived at the center of his own small, isolated kingdom, thwarted by circumstance, human limitations, humbled by repeated misfirings of his plans. But the disappointments and setbacks never extinguished the compulsive drive that propelled him onward. To the end, the last conquistador remained true to his vision." End quote. Now, Simmons wrote those words in 1991, with the release of his book. Now, I disagree with Simmons on some of those points, mainly on the durability of the foundations Oñate set. They had to be torn out with bloodshed, an event that would nearly end the entire colony. He traveled on routes that others, from Chamuscado to Levia, before him had begun to map out. But in his story, we see echoes of another man, whose ventures could be considered a failure. That Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Both men set out to make a profit, only to find out the hard truth about New Mexico. It was poverty-stricken, and eking out a living would be difficult for both an enterprising Spaniard or Puebloan. Oñate appears to be a man who had a hard time playing the political game, which appears to have been what caused many of his problems in getting the venture off the ground. It may have contributed to some of the problems he had controlling his men. Let it be remembered that at least some of his men may have been planted by his political enemies to tank the venture. But these just look at the first layer of Oñate's legacy. It's about time I take a look at the controversy that has surrounded Oñate. Others have described the situation differently from how Simmons has. From my text, a Central University of New Mexico website, quote, "As New Mexico state historian Rick Hendricks has put it, although some despise him and others admire him, Juan de Oñate towers over the history of New Mexico. No matter what side of the state's early history you're on, Oñate's actions directed the colony's origins for better or for worse. Yet his contested legacy became powerfully apparent during preparations to honor his colonization effort in recent years. And no event has become a bigger albatross around the neck of his legacy than the Acoma massacre and the subsequent mutilations." John Kessel, in his book Pueblo Spaniards in the Kingdom of New Mexico, would also note the following about the controversy over Juan's actions in the 1599 and 1600. Quote, "In truth, the resilient people of the Rock, some of whom never left, had better things to do. By the 1620s, they had firmly reestablished their pueblo, and thereafter went about the business of cultural survival. None of the visiting late 19th and 20th century ethnologists who studied the western pueblos sensed a festering tradition of resentment at Acoma. The documentary record of the 1599 trial, meanwhile, lay hidden in Spain's Archive of the Indies. Only in 1927, the publication of historian George P. Hammond's doctoral dissertation, Don Juan de Oñate and the Founding of New Mexico, did a summary of Oñate's cruel sentence reemerge." End quote. Kessel as a whole takes a more conciliatory tone towards Oñate in his text, suggesting that the mutilations were much smaller in scope, if they happened at all. This does suggest that the controversy around his legacy is a more recent trend, perhaps reflecting a greater emphasis on the role and perspectives of indigenous people with colonial history. But the real controversy seems to have taken off somewhere between Simmons' 1991 text and Kessel's 2008 text. A statue of Oñate was installed in Alcalde, New Mexico, in January 1998 to commemorate the anniversary of entrance into New Mexico. That night, a group of people who called themselves Friends of Acoma removed the statue's right foot, quote, "boot, stirrup, star-shaped spur, and all," end quote. The group would release the following statement, quote, "We took the liberty of removing Oñate's right foot on behalf of our brothers and sisters of Acoma Pueblo," end quote. Again, to quote from my text, quote, "They went on to explain that they found no glory in the celebration of Oñate, and they did not want their faces rubbed in it. Daryl Chino, an Acoma artisan that was interviewed about the incident, commented, 'It was funny when it happened to the statue. It wasn't funny when it happened to real people.' For centuries, the Acoma people have passed on the story of the Spanish governor's atrocities against their force. To them, this history was and is still very present." End quote. The vandalism of this statue would even make it to the New York Times. The issue isn't black and white, though. Hispanics in New Mexico have different feelings. To them, Oñate is the man who started their involvement in New Mexico off and brought their ancestors to their home, even if they didn't directly come with it. Esteban Arellano, the director of the Oñate Monument and Visitor Center, would comment on the removal of the foot. Quote, "Give me a break. Here's 400 years ago. It's okay to hold a grudge, but for 400 years?" End quote. Statues of Oñate would continue to be controversial. In 2007, dedication of another statue to Oñate, which had earlier been renamed the Equestrian in El Paso, Texas, would also be met with protests. Controversy about Oñate would not end in the early to mid-2000s, however, and even echoes down to today. With the protest over the killing of George Floyd in 2020, there would be another wave of protests over the existence of statues for Oñate and other colonial controversial figures. In June 2020, during a protest over a statue of Oñate called La Jornada at T. Wesh Park in Albuquerque, a man would throw a woman to the ground. The man would then shoot the woman 4 times at close range with a handgun. I've linked the KRQE article on the incident in the show notes. This would not be the only time a protester would be shot over a statue of Oñate. In September 2023, Rio Arriba County officials had planned to replace the statue in front of the Rio Arriba courthouse in Estimil, sparking another wave of protests. As a result, the officials would decide to postpone replacing the statue. A celebration of this decision to postpone replacing the statue would then be held. During this celebration, a man celebrating the event would be shot by a counter-protester. Conversations over the legacy of colonial figures like Oñate, who did do some horrible things, are difficult. Violence does little to help these conversations, and just leads to more pain and resentment for men who are long dead. I think here's where I will leave Oñate behind, and we will move on to the future of New Mexico. There's still much to do to build the colony.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.